Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first seminar of the Antigender Politics and Feminist Struggles series, organized by Feminist Approaches in Culture and Politics with the support of Friederike Ebert Stiftung. We are very excited to have John Scott as our speaker tonight. So welcome and thank you very much for being with us tonight, John. And I want to thank you all who are attending this event tonight. First, some housekeeping details. This talk will be recorded and made available online later. Following the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Your questions will be taken via chat box and I will be reading them to our speaker. Throughout the session, there will be simultaneous translation. And the details will be in the chat box. You can also follow the chat box. In the upcoming edition of our journal, we will be focusing on anti-gender politics and feminist struggles and how these two forces play out in specific local contexts, such as Russia, Poland, and obviously Turkey. What might be called as gender backlash or anti-gender politics movements or politics and movements against the rights of women and LGBTQ people are on the rise all over the world, including our country, Turkey. Particularly now, on the eve of the forthcoming presidential and parliamentary elections, rights of women and LGBTQ people are at the forefront of populist politics. And gender, a term which is quite foreign to the broad public in Turkey, is instrumentalized by the authoritarian conservatives as a signifier to construct discourses and develop politics against the rights of women and LGBTQ people. And today we have John Scott with us to discuss this global and local wave of gender backlash. John Scott is a professor emerita at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. She is the author of the classic Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Analysis, which challenged the prevailing ways of writing history and became a milestone for feminist historiography that went far beyond simply adding women to historical narratives. She has published numerous books and articles on the intertwined relations of gender, power, knowledge, politics, law, and economics, making a great contribution to social sciences in general. Her most recent books are Knowledge, Power, and Academic Freedom, and On the Judgment of History. She is the founding editor of History of the Present, a journal of critical history. Her works have been translated to numerous languages, including Turkish. For example, a collection of her essays was published as Feminist Tarihin Peşinde, In Pursuit of Feminist History by Siyasette Publishing House. And also her book, Politics of Veiling, is translated to Turkish as Örtünmenin Siyaseti by Boğaziçi University Publishing House. She has long been a supporter of and contributor to our journal, Kültür ve Siyasette Feminist Yaklaşımlar, Feminist Approaches in Culture and Politics. Various works of Scott are significant for historicizing and analyzing the political climate of gender backlash that we face today. For Scott, gender is not merely about sexual identities, it's a mirror to understand different power dynamics in a society. And today, in her talk titled Gender Backlash, she will explore the psychodynamics of the backlash by authoritarian politicians against gender, asking how the insistence on a return to normal gender relations helps to consolidate their power. This talk will be based on the article that we are going to translate to Turkish and publish in our forthcoming issue in the fall. So I hope this was not a long introduction, and thank you again for being with us tonight, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Zeynep. It's a pleasure to be back again, even though I'm not physically there in Istanbul. The journal Feminist Approaches in Culture and Politics has been my I don't know what to call it, my connection to Turkey for very many long years, from the time that Aslan first contacted me about translating some article of mine. I felt like I've been part of the effort of that journal, and it's been a real pleasure to be part of it. And working with you on the translation of my articles in the book that you mentioned was also one of the really rare and happy academic experiences that I've had in doing that kind of work. So I'm really pleased to be back, even though virtually, and to talk today about it's a slightly shorter version of the piece that you're going to publish in the journal, but it's talking about gender backlash. So here we go. In this talk, I ask why teaching about gender and sexuality have become such politicized issues in recent years. How is it that Viktor Orban in Hungary has tied the abolition of gender studies program to his illiberal democracy? Why did Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil want to outlaw any references in school textbooks to feminism, homosexuality, and the teachings of the democratic educator Paulo Freire? Why, as he dismantled the Russian constitution, did Vladimir Putin have his government decriminalize domestic violence and begin to prosecute feminist activists as extremists who are endangering traditional values and national security? Why has Recep Erdogan in Turkey insisted that women can never be men's equals because motherhood is their exclusive foreordained calling? Why has the government of Narendra Modi, India's hyper-nationalist prime minister, defunded and redefined the mission of university centers for women's studies and for the study of social exclusion? What, in addition to his ardent Catholicism, is behind the Italian rightist Matteo Salvini's war on gender indoctrination in the classroom? How is Trump's white supremacist base, women included, secured by his evident misogyny? And why have populist right-wing parties all over the world mounted campaigns against so-called gender ideology as they seek to topple the democratic institutions in their countries? This is a transnational movement, if not always directly coordinated, at least drawing inspiration from one another's programs. What is the ideological basis for the backlash against gender? What are the psychic as well as the political appeals of this backlash? It's important to note first that gender, as these populists use it, refers promiscuously to many things in these campaigns: feminism, sexuality, LGBTI rights, and any representations of personhood outside the boundaries of what is deemed normal. My own definition of gender is as a social attribution of sex identities, one that has varied over time and in different political and cultural contexts, one that always structures relations of power. It's precisely its mutability and its exposures of power that trouble these authoritarians who want men and women to be universal, eternal categories upon which their social and political order can rest. The talk has 3 parts. In the first, I place the attack on gender studies in the context of a larger effort to direct public higher education to instrumental ends: vocational training, economic development, technical innovation, and away from the critical knowledge production that was once, at least ideally, central to its mission. In the second part, I explore the ideological bases for this backlash, particularly its invocation of the patriarchal nuclear family as the natural basis for social and political organization. In the third part, I consider the ways in which feminist understandings of the mutability and variability of gender threaten constructions of masculinity, whose defense in the name of God, nature, or just plain common sense then becomes a key component in the mobilization of authoritarian rulers' constituencies. So the first part. The scholar Devaditya Bhattacharya argues persuasively that interdisciplinary programs like gender studies have performed a critical role in knowledge production that are at odds with the more traditional emphases of the disciplines. The creation of these programs in the United States in the late 1960s and 70s was part of an effort to meet the demands of increasingly diverse student bodies for courses relevant to their histories and experiences, that of women and various minorities, racial, sexual, religious. The attempt to produce new knowledge required exceeding a range of disciplinary problematics, And it carried with it a critical function that not only underscored the limits of any single discipline, but opened the possibilities for stretching the boundaries of what counted as legitimate inquiry. Despite accommodation and co-optation, these programs have for the most part maintained their critical function, exploring alternative epistemologies, those areas of inquiry that lie outside the purview of the specialized knowledges of the disciplines. For example, feminists and their allies called into question the claimed objectivity of science, substituting standpoint epistemology for the universalist position of knowledge producers. Of course, not all interdisciplinary programs have served that purpose. Even some of the radical ones had more to do with philosophical explorations of difference than with egalitarianism. Some have been co-opted by the neoliberal university to spur innovation that will meet new market demands. In a time when vocational training has become the new rationale for higher education, all sorts of mixed interdisciplinary programs have emerged to serve those ends. But some interdisciplinary programs have remained centers of critical inquiry with a tie to what they define as social justice. By social justice, Bhattacharya means inclusion and equity for those typically considered outsiders or others. And this requires a critical relation to prevailing modes of being and truth. Writing in defense of academic freedom in 1902, a different moment from ours, the American philosopher John Dewey noted that scholars in the emerging social and humanistic fields needed the protection of academic freedom more than hard scientists because they dealt so closely with the problems of life and so faced intense prejudice and emotional reaction. And here's the quote from Dewey: "These prejudices exist because the habits and modes of life to which the people have accustomed themselves. To attack them is to appear to be hostile to institutions in which the worth of life is bound up." That surely was how feminist demands to include women on faculties and research on women in the curriculum were greeted as the second wave emerged. In the last decades of the 20th century, skepticism and hostility to feminist challenges were widespread and punitive. I don't think I need to remind you of how hard we worked and how fierce was the opposition we encountered. That we prevailed was a matter of timing. The economically expansive years of the second half of the 20th century, the need to increase the numbers of educators as college and university populations expanded, the Cold War context, which sought to refute Soviet communism by associating capitalism and democracy with greater equality for women and African Americans, funding from liberal philanthropic foundations to promote gender justice all over the world, and the sheer persistence of feminists to act in a moment of the expansive context in which we found ourselves. We faced backlash, to be sure, but the difference between then and now is the difference between then, a liberalizing political economy, tolerant, reformist, and now, the crisis of neoliberal capitalism that has brought populist authoritarian politicians, intolerant, reactionary, fascistic, to the fore. Both then and now, however, feminists were accused of wanting to destroy the family, the institution more than any other with which the worth of life is bound up. From this perspective, programs like gender studies, combining as they do critical thinking and ethical commitments to justice and egalitarianism, are among the last bastions of critique, once thought to be at the heart of the university's mission. Is it any wonder that these political rulers, seeking to implant their power, want to root out those they take to be challenging the very basis on which their power rests? As right-wing parties gain visibility and voice in still nominal democracies, centrists and conservatives have joined the assault on spaces within universities that produce knowledge at odds with what passes for common sense. Gender studies, with its critique of inequality and its exploration of non-conforming sexualities and alternatives to normative families, has for that reason become a primary target. So the critical work of gender studies programs is one of the reasons for the backlash. However small and seemingly innocuous these gender studies programs are, they have become the target because they threaten to undermine the very grounds on which political and social order is thought to rest. So now the second point, the family. An imagined, idealized family is at the center of backlash campaigns, whether defined in religious terms by evangelicals and Catholics as a God-given institution, or in secular terms as natural or cultural. It reflects less the realities of sexual and intimate relationships than it does an aspiration to certainty and stability in this realm. The discourse of the family has long served to refuse feminist calls for change. This is apparent in the backlash against successful campaigns for women's liberation, same-sex marriage, and the rights of non-gender conforming people, all of which require the denaturalizing of gender, its definition not as a reflection of the predictable determinations of biology, but as a set of normative regulations, as an exercise of power. We now hear regularly about the dangers of gender ideology, a term probably first coined by Cardinal Ratzinger before he became Pope Benedict XVI, a term that has gained traction around the world. The word ideology was meant to refer to something artificial, as opposed to the natural and immutable difference of sex embodied in the heterosexual nuclear family. Pope Francis has likened gender ideology to nuclear annihilation. So dangerous is it, he thinks, to the social order. Others link it to communism, or to the loss of parental authority and the subversion of so-called family values, to pedophilia and the sexualization of young children in state schools. Despite their theological differences, some Catholics, Protestant evangelicals, and Muslims have united in campaigns against the toleration of what they deem to be deviant sexualities. In the name of respecting so-called natural law, they have insisted on the importance of religion as the guardian of morality in the public sphere. Their influence has not been lost on otherwise secular politicians, Trump, Berlusconi, Bolsonaro, who cynically invoke religious morality and the sacralized family in their programs for reform. The family, seen as the crucible of morality, came fully into its own along with the modern state in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The timing was not coincidental. The family was taken to be the very foundation of the state, the culmination of civilization, the natural way of ordering social relations in the interest of reproducing the species, the race, and the nation. Michel Foucault related this family to biopower, the designation of life, quote, as a political object, indispensable to the development of capitalism and the state. Sex, Foucault tells us, was the pivot of the two axes, the disciplining of bodies and the regulation of population. The instrument of that regulation was the nuclear family, the product, it was believed, not of human invention, but of nature. In the 19th century, the German Johann Fichte wrote, quote, "The marriage relation is the true mode of existence of grown persons of both sexes, required even by nature," end of quote. And the French minister of cults under Napoleon, Portalis, opined that marriage was, quote, "neither a civil nor a religious act, but a natural act, which has drawn the attention of legislators and which religion has sanctified." The realization of this natural institution was said to have been the achievement of civilization. So in their thinking, the family as a natural institution precedes the cultural appropriation of it or the religious sanctification of it. The American anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan offered a universal model, quote, "As now constituted, the family is founded on marriage between one man and one woman. A certain parentage was substituted for a doubtful one, and the family became organized by property rights and privileges. Upon this family as now constituted, modern civilized society is organized and reposes." The colonial powers that claimed to embody civilization sought to impose this model on their subjects, an aspect of what the French referred to as their civilizing mission. Those racial others, whose families were organized differently, were treated as savages and barbarians. This representation serving not only to mark their inferiority, but to bolster the representation of the superiority of the white middle class. In the vision of the natural family, the division of labor between husband and wife, he the breadwinner and owner of household property, she the dependent provider of unpaid domestic work, was an instrument for capitalism's assignment of economic responsibility for reproduction, largely to the family. But it was also the model for a range of hierarchical relations that reached well beyond the household and the economy to the state itself. The French sociologist Frédéric Leplay noted that, quote, private life stamps public life with its character. The family is the foundation of the state, end of quote. The political theorist Robin Marasco points out that the family's authoritarian structure embodies relations of domination, husband, wife, parents, children, that produce political subjects who understand their place as part of a natural order. The feminist denaturalization of gender, our insistence that it is relations of power, not biology, that give meaning to sexual difference, is rightly perceived as a challenge to the very structures of political authority by democratic as well as authoritarian rulers. The ferocity of the assault on gender ideology should tell us how high the stakes are for the politicians who are leading the attack. We hear an anguished prophecy of disaster from opponents of feminist and queer theories who argue that historicizing established norms about men and women is an assault against the very basis of civilized life. The defenders of church and state argue that if equality between women and men, to say nothing of the simple recognition that gender norms have a history, if that equality were to prevail, the entire social order would crumble. And in a sense, they're right. For feminists, the word gender necessarily implies a critique of the certainty of biology, and so suggests intolerable instability to the forces of order. This upsets what has become the common sense view that the roles assigned to differences of sex were ordained by God or followed from nature. That in the political as in the domestic realm, males are meant to dominate, women and children to flourish under their protection. Ironically, of course, the view that biology is destiny is itself the product of relatively recent history. The emergence of modern nation states brought with it a new insistence on the immutability of gender roles and the policing of sexual activity to keep them in place. It's here that the real gender ideology comes to the fore, not the supposed gender ideology attributed to feminism, but the conservative gender ideology that makes sexual difference the basis for political rule. On the one hand, the natural difference of sex provides legitimacy for men's exclusive political authority. On the other, men's political authority is evidence for nature's mandate. Tautological as this may be, it is the reasoning that for generations and for many still today has provided the common sense view of the relationship between the family and the state. Despite periodic feminist and socialist challenges to its hegemony, this view of the family took hold in Western social imaginaries, serving as a powerful defense of whatever status quo seemed threatened. The Australian historian Melinda Cooper has written brilliantly about the way in which, in the US since the 1970s, in the context of stagflation, the waning influence of Keynesianism, the end of the Fordist consensus, the weakening power of labor unions, and the extension of welfare benefits to African Americans, how all of that since the 70s, neoliberalism and conservatism converged on the naturally altruistic private caregiving family as an alternative to state-sponsored social welfare programs and to the sexual revolutions of the liberated, explosive 1960s. that privatizing of the sort of naturally altruistic puts care, social welfare of all kinds in the private domain of the family, and usually in the hands of women in the family. Although Cooper's work focuses on the US, its insights can be extended elsewhere. The conservative view of the family as society's moral foundation provides a welcome correction to neoliberalism's market individualism. They are, however, not incompatible, but mutually reinforcing. The one supports the other in the rhetoric of reactionary populism, transferring the onus for inequality from capitalism and the state to cosmopolitan elites, immigrants, and in the United States, Black welfare cheats, all of whom are depicted as victimizers of the families of the respectable white working class. This family is, of course, a fantasy, as rates of divorce, domestic abuse, incest, and addiction across class and racial lines make clear. But that makes it more rather than less appealing. In fact, it's precisely as a fantasy that the family constitutes an object of desire in the rhetoric of populist leaders, a promise to restore a lost paradise that has been stolen by immoral others who have upset the stable functioning of economy and society. I'm arguing here that the fantasy of a stable, male-headed, heterosexual household has endured despite profound changes in the institution itself. It is this fantasy that is deployed in the service of reaction, attributing to gender ideology responsibility for its corruption and dysfunction, a displacement of causality that, largely because of its psychic appeal, no arguments from history or reason have been fully able to refute. So that's the second point. The first point was the critical function of gender studies program. The second point, the power of the ideology of the heterosexual nuclear family. And finally, the third part, the psychic issues and the question of masculinity. At the heart of the fantasy of the patriarchal family is the rule of the father, who is taken to be the source of support and protection for his dependents. In a now classic essay, written as the United States went to war in Iraq in 2003, in response to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the feminist political theorist Iris Marion Young described a logic of masculinist protection. She argued that perceived threats to a nation's security lead citizens to accept and endorse authoritarian rule, thus voluntarily abdicating their democratic rights. This puts women and men in a, quote, subordinate position of dependence and obedience, like that of women in a patriarchal household, where even in democracies, the logic of masculinist protection is in operation. Young wrote that these rulers often present themselves as benign figures, more associated with ideas of chivalry than with aggression and bullying. Quote, patriarchal power as protection is more like pastoral power than the repressive power of the king. Although, she says, since a security regime cannot allow expressions of dissent, the danger of a turn to fascism, the extreme form of a security regime, is always there. I think we're now at the moment of the extreme form of a security regime, when, drawing on the legacy of history, rulers are increasingly intent on wiping out challenges to the masculinity that underwrites their political power. There are many bases to that political power, economic, political, material. My interest here is in the psychic aspect of it, the appeal to masculinity that underpins it. Young was right to name the promise of protection a masculinist logic, but I want to deepen our understanding of the operations of that logic by bringing psychoanalytic theory to bear on political theory, specifically by using Freud and Lacanian readings of Freud to think, together with the writings on democracy of the French political theorist Claude Lefort, about the phenomenon of indeterminacy that lies at the heart of this masculinist logic. Freud and Lacan remind us of the indeterminacy, the enigma of sexual difference, and so of the very uncertainty of the very meanings of male and female. There is no fixed meaning we can attribute to differences of sex. Historians and anthropologists have shown how these meanings have varied in different cultures and at different moments in time. Yet precisely because sexual difference is so central to the representation of social relationships, and because it cannot be ultimately made certain, pinned down, and defined, great effort has been expended to ground its meaning in biology. The body is the indisputable determination, the natural site of the social meanings of masculinity and femininity, upon which entire social and cultural edifices are built. Whether taken as God's word or nature's dictate, the biology of sexual difference has become the basis for imagining social, political, and economic order, and thus for the regulation and punishment of behaviors that transgress heterosexual dualities. Those heterosexual dualities are the common sense about the natural order of the family, with its deep historical roots that I referred to earlier. But it's just not just a matter of policing sex. The aim is to secure stability for a matrix upon which visions of social, economic, and political order rest. And because sex is always associated with excess, impulses, drives, feelings that elude control, it always constitutes a threat to established order. Claude Lefort's notion of indeterminacy provides me with a political reading for the indeterminacy of the meanings of sex. Lefort argues that the end of absolutism, and with it the loss of its legitimating religious authority, introduced a new uncertainty about political representation. Possession of the phallus, the symbol of the ruler's power, was no longer the prerogative of God's representative on earth. And as the reign of kings and the occasional queen gave way to representative systems of government, parliaments, constitutional monarchies, republics, democracies, the physical body of the ruler, as the incarnation of sovereignty, was replaced by a set of disembodied abstractions: state, nation, citizen, representative, individual. In the abstract, the impossibility of power's embodied representation is clear. But for those who implemented the system, the question of who was charged with articulating and enforcing the degrees remained. So you have this political uncertainty about who it is that is the legitimate ruler or representative or political voice in a democracy. And others like Jacques Rancière argue that that's the whole point of democracy. There's no legitimacy for those who take up or who are attributed a political voice. But it's here, and so that leaves open that question of on what basis, on what ground is it legitimate to take political power? And it's here that Freud's theorizing, especially in Totem and Taboo, helps shed some light on the reasons that men become the embodiments of political authority, at least in Western democratic polities. It's important to understand that Freud is offering a theoretical fiction, a myth, if you will, as a way of accounting for what he takes to be an evident truth of political psychology. In his mythical account, there was a primal father, a king, whose power lay in his monopoly of all pleasure. Lesser men eventually kill, and in Freud's version, eat him, in order to gain the access that they have been consistently denied. By devouring the father figure, the men retrospectively become brothers. Coming into their own as adults required the sexual initiation that the father had forbidden them, an appropriate woman of their own. The brothers institute a prohibition of incest to ensure that this woman will not be a mother or sister, all of whom have been game for the primal father's seductions. The rule of the sons then replaces the absolutism of the father. Some form of fraternity overthrows the reign of the king. In Freud's terms, an ideal father replaces the primal father. It is he or they, the sons acting collectively to achieve this ideal, whose actions must protect society from a return of excess. There were nonetheless continuing rivalries among the brothers, and these were managed by assigning to each a smaller, tamer version of what they had rebelled against. The laws of marriage in this vision ensured that each brother had his own woman and that no brother had more than one. in the realm of the psyche, shared political power, democracy, then depends on the disciplining of sexuality by marriage, the containment of desire within a socially beneficial family unit. But desire can never be fully contained, and so the brothers compete among themselves in order that one of them will be able to assume the slain father's power. Freud noted that, quote, each of them would have wished, like his father, to have all the women to himself, end of quote. This fantasy, the notion that his likeness to the primal father exempts one of the brothers from castration, domination, control by the father. Lacan calls it the phallic exception, is ever present, expressed not only in adulterous liaisons, but in all manner of political contests in which candidates seek to display the signs of their exceptionalism. Here we might think of any of those authoritarian pretenders displaying forms of hypermasculinity, Trump surrounded by glittering women, displaying muscular bodies that they actually don't have, defying the COVID-19 virus, as they strive to reincarnate the deposed father's monopoly of power, making law even as they transgress the law. It also applies to the all-powerful image, another fantasy, of the protective superfather who can fix anything, who protects his family from its enemies, who's the sole source of their prosperity, comfort, and well-being. At least in the West, the excessive display of sexual prowess is the animating force of the masculinist logic of protection. It justifies the extraordinary power the authoritarian ruler assumes. But the apparent claim to this individual man's uniqueness actually feeds a collective male fantasy. Their projected identification with him is the source of the libidinal appeal of these rulers. The rulers represent the fulfillment of their followers' fantasy of a restored masculinity, the promise to them to bring back a lost or threatened order of social, political, and economic, political and economic, racial, and gender hierarchy. Listen to the Republican Senator Josh Hawley seeking to refute what he calls the emasculation of the American man. Liberals, he told the National Conservative Conference in 2021, are attempting to, quote, give us a world beyond men as part of their aim to deconstruct America. So the world beyond men, the demasculation of Americans, is connected to the deconstruction, the dismantling, the destruction of American society. Quote, again, here's a quote, the left want to define traditional masculinity as toxic. They want to define the traditional masculine virtues, things like courage, independence, and assertiveness, as a danger to society. In Hawley's eyes, the future of American society rests on the protection of this version of masculinity. I'm suggesting that the dilemma of political indeterminacy that I referred to when I talked about Lefort finds resolution in appeals to a naturalized sexual difference that makes masculinity, powerful masculinity, synonymous with political rule. Modifications to this rule and challenges to it are possible in historical moments of stability and prosperity. Calls for sexual democracy echo to us from the more optimistic times at the end of the last century. But when indeterminacy becomes intolerable, as it has in this moment of global capitalism's neoliberal crises, extremes of economic inequality within and across nations, massive displacement and transfers of populations, unending wars, insurmountable debt, those who seek to stabilize, indeed to embody political authority, make the certainty of sexual difference a cornerstone of their appeal. To secure the foundations firmly in place requires legislation to fix the meanings of gender, to regulate sex, sexuality, and marriage, to strictly enforce common sense views of the patriarchal family as the source of the health and well-being of the state. In this context, feminism's historicizing and denaturalizing of gender is rightly taken to be a dangerous, destabilizing force that must be defeated at all costs, hence the backlash. I just want to show you for this masculinity thing, I don't know if Erdogan has images like this, but the Rambo image of these populist authoritarian leaders is extraordinary and is not only as the one I'm going to show you here of Donald Trump. Look at those muscles that he doesn't have. But this is at a gun show. There was a Confederate flag in the background, and Donald Trump shown holding an AK-47 as the defender of and protector of American society. So just now to conclude, I've been seeking to understand the backlash against gender as a refusal of the critical knowledge production associated with some interdisciplinary work in universities. To the extent that gender studies look to end discrimination based in the normative regulation of sex and sexualities, it occupies a critical position that produces knowledge in the interest of bringing about social change. Such change is anathema to conservative and right-wing movements, which endorse and benefit from what they conceive to be natural hierarchies of social and political organization. To the extent that the patriarchal nuclear family provides a model for those hierarchies, maintaining its status as natural is of particular concern for these groups. Their authoritarianism relies on an endorsement of the power of paternal rule. Their psychic appeal offers the fantasy of the primal father as the incarnation of that power, the power to dominate and to protect, and so to restore a lost order, really the fantasy of a lost order, the order of nature, of sexual difference, biological men and women, marriage between a man and a woman, as the foundation of political rule. This is the ideology of patriarchy that, for all of the modifications of it, retains a strong hold on what counts as common sense. It provides authoritarian rulers and their parties with a resource to be drawn on as they mount their challenges to democracy. Feminist teachings about the mutability, uncertainty, and variability of gender pose an important obstacle to this ideology. And psychoanalytic insights about the uncontainability of sex only add flames to this fire. The closing down of gender studies programs then signals how dangerous our feminist work has become to the ambitions of populist authoritarians and their followers. The backlash, the efforts to close us down, are frightening, but also oddly encouraging. They tell us how significant a challenge our work of historicizing and denaturalizing gender norms presents to the enemies of democracy and social change, and how important it is to maintain that challenge, to keep thinking, writing, and teaching the things that cause these tyrants to tremble, if not always to fall. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this thought-provoking talk. To start the debate, we have already questions on chat, but I will use my privilege as a moderator and I will start with my question, if it's also okay for you. Mine is a bit self-critical question. Like you, in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned about this neoliberal restructuring of education in the universities, like how critical thinking is being replaced by functionalist and vocational training programs and also structures. And also you refer to this academic trend, which focuses on this philosophical explorations of differences rather than focusing on studies that are related to egalitarianism and social justice. Do you think, and these have tremendous effects, especially on interdisciplinary programs like gender studies. Do you think that this analysis is also relevant for gender studies? I mean, and if you think so, how do you think gender studies programs deviating from social justice approach is also related to gender backlash? Do you think these tendencies also contribute to anti-gender discourses and policies? I don't know.
It's sort of yes, I guess my answer would be yes and no. I take the middle ground.
Okay.
First, I do think that a number of gender studies programs, I would say, have gone the way of, have moved from critical explorations of the meanings of sexual difference to attempts to confirm the certainties of identity. They've moved from critical explorations of and the impossibility of defining sexual difference to attempts to nail down and themselves insist on the certainty of identity. And so, which is an attempt, I think, politically to argue for anti-discrimination law, egalitarianism, social justice of various kinds, but have taken what I think of as the best of the critical aspects of the programs into a realm of political advocacy, which undermines or undercuts the more open critical exploration of questions related to sex and sexual difference. So I think in that sense, it's not so much to the extent that neoliberalism involves a kind of nailing down of identity politics and of certainty of identity politics. You could say that some of these programs have become examples of the impact of identity and the need to argue about and talk about identity, the need to confirm, to prove, to establish, to solidify identity. You could see that as part of these trends. I think my answer would be that the loss of critical engagement by some gender studies programs, not all, has to do with the turn to a kind of identity politics. It's not about giving up on social justice. It's about giving up on critical thinking.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think now we can continue with the questions in the chat box. I will go in order. The first questions are in English, so I will read them.
Okay.
Thank you, John, for sharing your knowledge and ideas with us, which I find enlightening. My question is, I believe that self-ID phenomenon and attack on women, mainly feminist women, claiming that they capitalize on their biology, gender, is yet another backlash. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Can you ask me that again? I'm not sure I understood it. Just read it again.
I believe that the self-ID phenomenon and attack on women, mainly feminist women, right, claiming that they capitalize on their biology, gender, is yet another backlash. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, the attempt to argue that. Although I guess that's not an argument I see as much. I mean, it may be that this is a critical argument that you're facing more often in Turkey. But I would say in the United States, there's less criticism of women using their biology as an excuse for certain kinds of privileges than there is an attack on the demand for women for equal treatment. The insistence that certain kinds of discrimination is sexual harassment and not just flirtation, or the arguments about Me Too that say that what's wrong with these women? Why didn't they say something 30 years ago? Why did they wait for so long to protest? It's about here the reaction is against feminist claims of discrimination and mistreatment by men and their supposed misunderstanding of the game of sex, which is about flirtation, and in France, seduction is the big deal. But I think that's so I'm less familiar with an argument that sort of sees women as privileging their biology and therefore asking for special treatment on those grounds. It seems to me the feminist arguments are not about that. They're about the fact that reproduction ought to be considered a right that women control, that access to, that women are not just childbearers and caregivers, but also people capable of doing all kinds of other work and so on and so forth. So that would be what I'm more familiar with as arguments against women, against feminism.
Okay. So the owner of this question was Şule Aytaç. Sorry, I missed the name before.
Mm-hmm.
And the next question is by Tuğba Ergün. We are faced with the acceptance of far-right parties like never before. We also know examples where leftist parties were not successful when it came to gender and women's rights. I think we need to problematize and rethink democracy and look for alternatives. What are your thoughts on this? Many thanks.
I think that's right. That the history of political parties, right or left, has not given much space to women or much thought to women and women's rights. Certainly, the socialists and the communists too always thought that women's emancipation would follow from the socialist revolution, and it didn't need to be taken up as an issue within democracy. But I don't know. I mean, I guess my feeling is right now that we can't give up on democracy, even if it's only rhetorical. that the institutions of democracy, the courts, the legal system, certain kinds of electoral politics are all we have at this moment, and they need protection because these guys, the point of this is to destroy them, is to take them over for authoritarian populist rule. And so I think the point is to argue that analyses of gender and the power relations between men and women, as I did in this talk, are central to the visions of democracy that we want to offer. And that sexual democracy, the French sociologist Éric Fassin talks about sexual democracy, is part of what democracy is. And you don't get real democracy without sexual democracy, which is not just about men and women, but about gay and lesbian rights, about, queer, also trans, queer, all of the sorts of non-normative sexualities that are part of what the community consists of, and eliminating the sort of hierarchies and discriminations against them is part of what we want to do in democracy. I just think in the moment we are in now, calling democracy itself into question is a dangerous step to take.
I totally agree. Okay, next question. It's in Turkish by Esra Aşan. Üniversitelerde toplumsal cinsiyet çalışmalarının kapatılması ya da etkinlik alanlarının...
The academics in your university, what kind of organizations are being taken by the academics in your universities against the social gender programs closure or the limitation on their activity areas?
That's a really good question, and it's a really difficult one to answer right now because, as you probably know, in the states of Florida and Texas and many other so-called red states, Republican-led states, those attacks are ruthless and very difficult to counter because the Republicans have not only seized control of the legislatures, but they've gerrymandered, they've organized the electoral districts to guarantee their reelection and their power. So defeating them at the ballot box is an extremely difficult thing to do. One of the things that is more and more prevalent across the country in the United States is unionization. You may know that at the level of universities, there was always a certain amount of resistance to trade unions because it was somehow going to compromise the more elite position. They would treat professors as workers, and that was somehow objectionable from the point of view of established faculty. That's gone, I think, and the unionization movements are growing with some success, not only of graduate students and what we call contingent workers, that is people who do not have tenure or the possibility of permanent tenured positions, but also the tenured faculties. Rutgers University, a couple of weeks ago, had a strike that lasted over a week of senior faculty joining to support wages and changes in benefits and working conditions for the most vulnerable faculty, contingent faculty, those who are not on permanent contracts, and graduate students. And the governor ultimately intervened. It's a blue state, it's a democratic state. And they won substantial improvements in pay and working conditions and so on and so forth. So it's hard to say what, and of course, some of that has to do with the extent to which boards of trustees and politicians can control things like gender studies programs. But it's very state by state. And as I said at the beginning of the answer to this, in the red states, the opposition is hard to find. You know, people will turn out and carry signs and protest, but the governors go right ahead and abolish the programs. They're abolishing tenure, permanent positions in those states as well. I think there are 20 some states now in which either have passed or are considering laws to abolish tenure. And along with that, the most radical in Texas and in Florida, and again in other states, the abolition of gender studies programs and of any studies, racial studies programs. You can't teach about the history of slavery anymore in those states, because you might make white children feel bad about what white people did to Black people in the past. So, but there's not a lot of there's protests, but in those red states, the protests have had very little effect. Overall, though, in terms of the control or attempts to control working conditions in universities, unionization is, even in those red states, appearing more and more as the solution, the collective response to the attacks on higher education that are coming more and more every day here. So unionization seems like the place where something to look for as positive political resistance is actually happening.
Okay. Thank you. I will continue with the next question by Ayten Sönmez. This one is in English. In your articles, you will explain that the discourse of family and family values are under attack is not a new discourse. We can even trace its history back to the French Revolution. Particularly in the 60s and 70s, we see the rise of feminist struggles against anti-gender discourses. How do you differentiate the struggles of that period from today's struggles? In which terms the historical context changed?
So I think I did that in the talk. I'm going to find the place where I said the difference between then and now. Then the 60s, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. There was all of this in the resistance in the 60s, but in the 60s, we thought we were winning. In the 60s, a lot of, and there was a lot of backlash, but a lot of good things happened in the 60s. There were women's studies programs were created. There was foundation, philanthropic foundation money that helped support it. There was a network in the United States of international gender studies, feminist studies, women's studies, whatever they called them at the different moments. But the 60s and 70s and into the 80s there was evident backlash, but there was also tremendous success. And programs got established, people were hired, books were published. The difference, I think, is that then, the 60s, was, as I said, a kind of a moment of open, yeah, here it is. I'll just read it again. That we prevailed then was a matter of timing. It was the economically expansive years of the second half of the 20th century, the need to increase the numbers of educators as college and university populations expanded. I mean, this is the moment of the 60s. When I entered the academic universe in the 1960s, it was because they were looking to bring women in because they didn't think they had enough men to teach the expanding university populations. And the expanding university populations meant including previously excluded people, Blacks, women, other ethnic minorities, Jews, other ethnic minorities who had always been systematically excluded from most aspects of higher education. Even if they went to college, there were hardly any professors. There certainly was no teaching of things like women's studies or African American studies or studies of race and ethnicity and so on and so forth. So you're in a moment of increasing the numbers of educators as college and university populations expanded. It's a Cold War context in which Soviet communism argues that America is a racist and misogynist society. There's in 1959, the great kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon, in which Khrushchev says, our women all go out to work, you know, we don't keep them at home strapped to the, and producing, you know, children, and we have emancipated women. And Nixon answers, well, our women have washing machines and refrigerators, and to make their justifiable life at home easier. And you sort of get this incredible kind of contrast between what the values are that are being supported, but nonetheless, in that context, greater equality for women and African Americans is on the agenda of political policy and political rulers and university presidents in that period. So it was and so the actions of feminists in an expanding context of great possibilities, however struggle it was to get them done, we really accomplished stuff. And, you know, Roe versus Wade, the law on abortion in 1973, was proof that, you know, we could change things. And that was the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s. The difference now is that you're facing a crisis of neoliberal capitalism. You have enormous contraction, austerity, expansion of debt, emphasis on vocational training as the role of universities, the transformation of the university into a kind of corporate entity interested in its brand and in its attracting customers who will be treated with kid gloves and allowed to sort of dictate what gets taught and in what ways. A corporate mentality that, at least in our universities, says, you know, we want to be able to get rid of faculty and courses that are no longer marketable. And so it's in a short way, it's the opening up of possibilities in the 60s and 70s and the closing down of them now. And that makes all the difference, I think, in the kinds of advocacy and the success that can follow or not from those advocacies.
Okay. Thank you. The next question, it's in Turkish and we don't have a name, an anonymous attendee.
Okay.
The content of the gender discussions are being manipulated. They say that it actually damages the rights of men, but actually what damages men is the patriarchal culture and the neoliberal capitalist policies themselves. Men are mobilized to stand against women's rights. Men's interest is directed not towards the system, but towards women. What would be the responsibility for a movement, as an anti-system movement, to be able to lead to a culture of masculinity that would be feministic and respectful of women's rights?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I have to confess I don't know the answer to it. I mean, I think that you're right that the attack on feminism and on gender studies and on so-called deviant sexualities or non-normative sexualities is a way of distracting attention from the economic and political disabilities that not only men, but men and women are facing in our current societies. But how to change that? I mean, I think that's what feminists have been trying to do for a long time. That is to argue and to bring our case forward that says, look, this is not about destroying men. This is about, in fact, changing the society so that everybody has a better possibility for life. Everybody has a better economic and social and political situation in life. But the great power of right-wing ideologies is to focus on so-called culture wars and cover over the economic issues that are undermining the situation of everybody, and that are sort of defining for white men an enemy in women who are trying to take away their jobs, or minorities who want to take away their jobs. That those culture wars kind of distract from what we might think of as political movements that would pinpoint the economic issues that are the ones that really need to be addressed and dealt with. But I have to say, in the moment we're in now, which feels so much like the 1930s, I feel I have to fight despair. I guess that's how to put it, because it seems like all of these efforts, which seem to be gaining strength, when the abortion decision was made in 1973, even though I'm a historian who doesn't believe in the inevitable progress of history, I thought we'd won it. That was over. And then last summer, in the summer of 22, the Dobbs decision, which overturned that abortion ruling and declared that abortion was not a right for women, and had, misogynist implications well beyond the ruling itself. And now these attempts to outlaw medication for use for medical abortions. I don't know how to, I don't know where it stops. And in our case, we have a Supreme Court that is now 7 of the 9 justices are Catholics, and most of them believe in, 6 at least of them don't believe that abortion is a right of women. I mean, so I don't know what the answer is beyond, as I said at the end of this talk, continuing to do what we've done so that there's at least some voice that says, this is not the way to think about these issues. There's an alternative way to think about these issues. And as you say, there's a long history of that that goes back, well beyond the 20th century, goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries at least, that insists that there's another way to think the relationship between the sexes and the relationship of sex and sexuality to politics than is now the case. But, we got to keep doing it and insisting on it. But I don't see a brilliant solution. I just don't see it.
Okay. I'll continue with the next question by Didem Türkoğlu. I want to follow up on Zeynep's question on gender studies programs. In order to overcome that identity politics trap in some institutions, which venues would have the most potential for progressive alliances, especially in putting more pressure on institutional insider politics? In parentheses, sorry, I was a bit late to talk, so hopefully we haven't covered that discussion yet with a smile.
So does she mean institutional politics in terms of the university? Is that what the question is?
Yes, I think.
Oh yeah, I think that's why the unionization thing movement here seems like a good thing. That is when everybody feels threatened in some way by the attacks that are being made on higher education and on the university. I mean, in some ways, wasn't the experience in Turkey with the petition, the Kurdish petition of a few years ago? I mean, didn't that create alliances across fields and disciplines and boundaries within the universities that hadn't existed before?
It did.
That was my sense, is that it did. And so that seems to me the model that faced with a kind of devastating attack on the institution itself, various members of the institution need to sort of overcome some of their disciplinary and internal political differences to say, okay, what is at stake here that we need to protect and hold on to, and somehow find the ways to articulate and to develop that resistance. And again, I think in the United States, unionization is the way that's happening. So the people who, my friends at Rutgers, say people who they never thought they would join a movement with were all there together out on strike a couple of weeks ago, banging drums, and students followed them out and supported them. And that, I think, in the face of a recalcitrant university administration, that made all the difference. So that's, I think, how politics has to proceed. It's alliances across difference in the immediate situation of an enemy that one perceives to be against all of us, rather than specifically against one part or another of the university. And in that sense, attacks on gender studies in the universities, it seems to me, are attacks on the university itself. And that argument needs to be made as clearly and as effectively as possible.
By the way, Didem has another comment about your previous comments on unions. Also, an addendum to the comment on unions. Florida and Texas are right to work states, making unionization extra hard too. This is what she added.
Yep. I mean, there's nothing to say except yes, these efforts will be met by conservative right-wing politicians who want to stamp out unions. And in the case of state universities, they are state employees, and so state laws about state employees apply to members of state university faculty. But yeah, I mean, the only thing is to sort of fight it at the level of what rights one has to form unions, and in some cases to try to vote these people out of office. The great victory in the United States last couple of weeks ago was the improbable election for the state Supreme Court justices. They vote in Wisconsin for members of the state Supreme Court. And the right-wing attacks on the courts, on voting rights, on universities was so great that the Democrat who was running and who promised to revoke an abortion law that would have that from the 1800s that abolished abortion forever, or in all cases and whatever, that the Democratic candidate for the court won overwhelmingly by something like 11 or 12 points, which usually in Wisconsin, the vote between right and left is like 1 or 2 percentage points. And this was a huge victory. And the turnout was enormous. And since the abortion decision in Dobbs last summer, the election of the Congress in 2022 was that overturning by the court mobilized opposition that in many states led to the election of Democrats who support abortion rights rather than of Republicans who don't. So, there are these different piecemeal resistances. In some of the states, the example is the election of this judge, who now will make a huge difference in what can and can't be done at the state level. In other cases, it's unions in some states. In other cases, it's faculty uniting to refuse to teach until certain kinds of commands are met. So, they're piecemeal opposition. You don't get a sense of a unified movement protecting the rights that we're interested in protecting. But it's not that there's no resistance, it's that it's partial and local and hard to see, even as it's operating at its own local level.
Okay. Next one. This one is in Turkish.
You, in your different writings, you are telling us that the concept of social gender means different things in different contexts and in different periods. And there is a series of critical discussion related to that the concepts cannot be fixated and they can signify different things. All these critical discussions, to what extent can they have an effect on the backlash against gender?
Well, I hope they can. I mean, I think that what we could say is that certainly from the 60s even until now, these critical discussions have had an effect, and it could be measured in, again, at least in the United States, the greater acceptance of gay marriage. Gay marriage was once anathema. If 20 years ago anyone had said that gay marriage would become a legal institution in the United States or in France or in other places where it has become, it's the work of feminists that and queer studies and gay and lesbian rights advocates that made that possible. And that created, I think, a real cultural change, so that in fact, even in the United States now, young people, those of us we've had in college courses, we could indoctrinate with our ideas. Young people have no problem about gay rights, about anti-discrimination laws against gays, have no problem with trans people, in fact. And so I think that the teachings that we have done, the success of the teaching of what we would call feminist and queer studies, the effect of that was to produce cultural changes, greater tolerance for so-called common sense, or for greater tolerance for challenges to normative common sense ideas about gender, about heterosexuality, about families. All of that made an impact. And it's that they're trying to undo now. In the United States, on the abortion question, something like 70 or 75% of Americans believe that abortion is a right women should have, at least in the first trimester of pregnancy. And so those are the lessons of feminists, right? Over the years, over 50 years of education and policy and writing and influencing the press and the media and stuff like that. So there's a culture out there in which these ideas are still very much alive. And the problem is these populist authoritarian right-wing types are looking to shut them down. And so the question, that's why I think I ended with a more positive note than maybe maybe I should have, but that we have to just keep doing it and keep insisting that these things we have taught and that we have argued for are right and make sense, and in fact apply to the lives of our families and our children. I mean, the number of people in the number of men in the United States or people and conservatives in the United States whose minds were changed by having a gay child, or the number of men who only had daughters, powerful men who only had daughters, and who suddenly faced the fact that their daughters were in a position where they couldn't inherit the business or couldn't sort of follow their fathers into law or medicine was sort of shocking. And I think the insistence on the part of feminists that this didn't have to be the case prevailed. And so, the numbers of women who are now lawyers or doctors is twice, 3 times what it was in the 1940s, 40s and 50s in the United States. So it's not like nothing has happened. It's like, in fact, all the gains that we made are infuriating these guys. And it's protecting them and insisting that we don't have to come up with anything new. We just have to keep saying what we've been saying all along. I think that's the short answer to it.
But this question is by Sermil Utku. Thank you for your inspiring talk. On the upcoming elections, we have less women representation. The ones who are lucky to be dominated are either visible personages or deal with economics. Can we correlate that to that of women's gender role where she is confined to the house?
I mean, the question is, are there fewer women than there have been in the past who are running for office?
She doesn't make a comparison because
there are just few women running.
Yeah, that's the case.
Well, you know, I don't think the existence of women per se is proof of anything. It depends on what policies they stand for. You know, Marine Le Pen and the whatever that party is called now in France, and what used to be the National Front, right-wing proto-fascist party in France is headed by a woman, and that doesn't mean that we want her to be in power. And Margaret Thatcher is another example. I mean, the women, it depends on the political positions that they take. That's what matters in these elections. And so if these are women who are just AKP sort of representatives who are going to do the same thing that Erdogan's people have been doing all along, it's not much of a gain for anything. The fact that they're running them is a gesture of inclusion, but it's not a significant gain for what we might think of as feminist politics or feminist representation.
So the next question is in Turkish.
I am trying to do a PhD study about the possibility of probability of feminist historiography through new media. What would be your some leading recommendations to me?
Well, you're asking the wrong person about media. Just like, I feel like I'm of the old school, right? I don't know how to think about the new media. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on any of these things. My grandson was telling me the other day about a course he was taking in which they were supposed to design some kind of digital something or other of the course. And I thought, why are they asking him just to write a paper? It was just like, and then I asked him what he was reading, and he said, well, they were reading excerpts, you know, digitized excerpts that they could read on there. So I'm the wrong person to ask that question. I mean, I think there are all sorts of ways in which you are in a much better position than I to know both what students respond to and what the more popular responses are to the uses of media. And I'm sure it's useful and important to be able to do. It's just that I feel like at my age and with my technical capacities, it's one of those things that I just have no good advice about. I'm sorry.
But this is all the social scientists, all of them are now focusing on these.
Yeah, everybody does. I mean, it really is. And, you know, fine. If it works and if it communicates things, that's really good. But I don't know how, as you saw, I mean, I didn't do a PowerPoint. I'm sure that other people will come and share their screen and have a PowerPoint for the whole lecture that they do. And I could have done that, but I really don't feel like I know how to do it. And I also feel like if I'm giving a lecture, people will listen to me. You know, I don't need to have distractions on the screen.
Exactly. Okay, next question is by Özlem Aslan.
Yes.
In the current context, what we see in many places is that neoliberalism is totally free from its liberal commitments like freedom of speech and right to organize. And feminism benefited from these liberal commitments for a while when neoliberalism was hanging on to them. But at the end, neoliberalism became merely about deregulation. The individual it aimed to create as an independent, self-reliant subject became very isolated and vulnerable. How do you think this isolation and vulnerability relates to gender backlash? How should feminism engage with this isolation and vulnerability?
No, I think that's a really good question. And again, it seems to me that the assertion of the alternative, the collective alternative, is still a possibility. That is, yes, we are all isolated individuals, and certainly students are made to think of themselves as coming to university to acquire human capital. In, you know, Wendy Brown's wonderful analysis of undoing the demos and the way in which the kind of rationalist logic or the logic of neoliberalism turns everything into an economic value. But I think we still have to say that there are alternative values and collective values that matter. and that what feminism has represented is a belief in collective approaches to these social and political issues. And it is happening. I mean, again, the union example, I think here is one to think about. That is that collective action is the only way to address the situations that people are facing in universities and in the political pressure against universities. And that those forms of collective action, even though they're initially about the protection of the individual rights of faculty members, are also achieved only by collective action. So I think there are examples of and recourse to collective action, collective consciousness, the thinking in terms of collective well-being, the common good rather than the individual good, that still hold promise for articulating an alternative to the neoliberal commitments. And maybe there's still enough of that sort of liberalism floating around in there to appeal to, and that people will hear as a better way to go than the entirely individualistic one that we're facing, that we're inevitably facing, given the power of that economic and political ideological formation these days.
Next one is by Özlem Altok. Thank you very much so much for this clear and powerful argument. I am from Turkey but teach in Texas, so I relate to much of what you said. As a sociologist, though, I have to ask a broader question here. I understand the psychoanalytical argument, the fantasy, in parentheses, but what about sociology? Are there insights that can be gained from sociological analysis of gender in explaining the current backlash?
Yeah, but I think those are out there already to have, that have to do with the material interests of workers. Some of the questions that have been raised about the ways in which the culture wars are a distraction from the economic plight of workers and middle-class people under neoliberalism. I mean, I think the reason that I wanted to talk about psychoanalysis is because that piece of it is often left out. In the discussions of the supporters of Trump in the United States, there was always, these were disaffected white people, and I think that the analysis is right, who are fear the changing demographics of the United States, in which brown and black people and will become the majority in the country at some point sooner rather than later. So that part of what we get with Trump is a reaction, a white supremacist, nationalist, Christian, all of those things, reaction to the looming transformation of this country into a more pluralistic, more multicultural country than before. So I think a lot of that analysis is already out there. But the reason I wanted to add the psychoanalytic is because it seems to me the psychoanalytic gives you a way of thinking about the irrational appeals of these things that matter. You can have all the rational answers you want to Trump or DeSantis or Abbott in Texas and the kinds of appeals that they're making, and nobody listens. I mean, how many lawsuits and revelations of Trump's crimes will it take to disaffect his followers? It hasn't had any impact at all on them. If anything, the fantasy of this guy, who's some of them think of as the second Christ. I mean, there are people who talk about him as having been sent by Jesus to save the world. The irrationality of their attachment is not analyzed in the way that the sort of more rational, materialist, interest-based analyses would be. And so I think it's really important to add the psychoanalytic dimension to it, because otherwise it just doesn't make sense. I mean, we could say these people are stupid and they don't know any better. We could say that and I think it's true, that our education system defunded and undermined as it's been over the past 50 years, has contributed to the dumbing down of the American population. But that still doesn't explain the kind of I can only call it erotic or libidinal appeal of this fat, clown to millions and millions of people. And the appeal of something like QAnon, these crazy conspiracy theories about blood drinking pedophiles and Democrats as Satan worshipers. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable, but you can't, if you dismiss it as stupidity, you don't get at what the nature of the appeal is. And, one of the things people are saying now about the fact that DeSantis, the governor of Florida, is probably not going to become the alternative to Trump is that he has none of the quote unquote charisma of Donald Trump. So what does that consist of? I mean, it doesn't appeal to me, but it's appealing to millions of people. And it has to have a kind of irrational psychoanalytic dimension in order to understand it and to figure out how to refute it. How do you go against that kind of appeal? By being a reasonable, nice person? I mean, Biden did that, and Biden won by being the normal and Trump being the crazy. But, Biden's approval ratings are way low, as they've always been through most of his presidency, despite the fact that he's done more to improve the economic position of many of Trump's followers than any other president in years and years. So, there's the rational economic interest argument. And it doesn't have the power to pull those millions of supporters away from Trump, who are just in love with whatever that Rambo guy with the AK-47 represents. So I just think it's really important for us to take that into account.
Okay, last two questions. This one in Turkish.
In Turkey, a man who is defining himself as a leftist might be looking at women movement as an identity politics which is dividing the class struggle, or he might be looking at homosexuality as a kind of American propaganda. Do you think that today's gender backlash is in parallel to this stance? If not, what are their differences?
Well, there's a long history of leftists arguing that all of these identity politics, as they would call them, feminist, queer, homosexual, all of that are distractions from the real class struggle. At the end of his life, Eric Hobsbawm said that, the French Marxist historian. So, I mean, I think that that's a fight we have to have on the left. That is that there is that there's a critique to be made of a leftist politics that wants to trivialize or make irrelevant the arguments about the importance of gender to the legitimation of political rule. And we just have to argue with these leftist candidates that, if they want the women's vote, or if they want a vote that endorses something beyond a kind of class struggle politics, they have to take these things into account. I mean, I just think that the kind of notion that class is the primary, it's true that class matters in these analyses and needs to be part of these analyses, but I think gender and race in the United States, certainly race, are in there making a difference as well and need to be incorporated into any class analysis that's offered.
Okay, last one. Do you think that women's and queer individuals' underrepresentation and insufficient nomination as candidates in political parties is a global issue? What strategies have been effective in countering gender backlash and promoting gender equity in politics? And despite all the setbacks, the feminist movement continues to be a formidable force in advocating for gender equity and social justice. What factors do you attribute to this?
Because they're right. They're good at their cause is just and their analysis is right.
And because they are normal.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think it's too big a question to answer about the world, about women in politics in the world. And I think it depends on the country. I think really there, you'd have to, if you want to do a comparative analysis, you'd have to do it. There we need the sociologists and the political scientists. We need to do a country by country analysis of the ways in which the position of women has in fact improved politically, what it's taken to do that, and how feminist, the sort of different ways in which feminist gains are possible in different political circumstances. So it's not a question I can answer in any specific way. I think that, yes, I was sort of half joking when I said it, but I think that you know, what feminists have argued for a very long time is that their analysis needs to be taken into account to understand political differences. There's a couple of books that have just been published about which rethink economic inequality in terms of the inequality, measure economic inequality in terms of not only class, but the inequalities of women within those class structures. I just think that work has to keep going. And the trouble is there's less funding for it, there's less attention to it, but you know, feminists and queer theorists and gay activists are, you know, are a persistent bunch. And I think that all we can say is we need to persist despite all of the terrific obstacles that are, for this moment at least, being put in our path. It's by no means a fight that's over. You know, the thing about academics is too, that the next generation, we're training the next generations of students. And that's something to sort of look upon as and to hold on to as a way of stopping what feels sometimes like a steamroller that's just coming over all of us, and more powerful than anything that we could imagine. These communicating and transmitting our particular positions and analyses continues to matter in the way in which future generations will handle and address these kinds of issues.
Thank you. I mean, these were all the questions. Thank you very much. I'm sure you are very tired, and we are sorry that we kept you so long. But
it's fine. It's fine.
I mean, really,
I'm not as tired as you are because it's not as late here as it is there.
No, it's okay. Night is young.
Yeah.
I mean, this was really a, you know, very insightful discussion, and thank you very much, and thank you for our attendees for being with us again till the end. We'll be continuing our seminars also in the fall with the writers of the articles that we are also going to publish. You should follow us on social media. We have some accounts. And you can be in touch with us via social media. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's really a real pleasure to be here.
I'm so sorry that I have forgotten to thank to Friederike Ebert Stiftung and Pınar Ecevit especially, and to our translators Müge Atala and Barış Yıldırım. So thank you very much. See you in our next events.